Hi, my name is Wase. I'm a beginner and I guess amateur landscape photographer, and today I want to talk about something that gets in the way of a lot of us from actually exploring landscape photography or photography in general, especially when we don't really have anything to start off with except for maybe our phones. To figure out what exactly that we need when we want to start photography, especially if we know that photography in general, when you think of camera, lens, etc., amounts to a massive amount of money being spent on something you don't even know if you want to do. And that's kind of what I was thinking as well when I thought about photography. And I think we get in this mindset of, oh, if I'm going to try and do something, I wanted to either buy the best gear or know that if I want to upgrade later on, it'll be just more cost. So I want to buy the best gear to get the best pictures, and that's how I want to start. But I kind of want to take a step back and debunk some of these ideas that get into our head when we think about landscape photography as a hobby, and basically give you an idea of what I was thinking when I started off landscape photography and the timeline in which I purchased the different gear and how I made those choices. So hopefully that might give you a better idea of what to look for and how you should frame your mind around basically buying gear. I'll go over from the basic gear that you probably are familiar with and my decisions around those, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the gear that you probably could wait on and you might not even need to purchase immediately. And then finally we'll go over kind of the general thought process of the approach to future thinking as well when it comes to photography and gear. So let's start off with the camera. And a really popular thing when you're starting off with landscape photography is use the camera you have. Basically the camera that you have is the best camera, really. And so for most of us it is our phone camera, but I really think, and I think for most of us, we don't really look at the photos that we take on our phone of landscape. We will likely end up either deleting it or never end up visiting them again. So I highly suggest to get an interchangeable lens camera as your first camera. But even in that, you have a couple of different choices when purchasing cameras. So I actually bought my camera because I thought I wanted to do YouTubing first, and that kind of got sidelined, and I picked it up and started doing photography with it instead. So you kind of have a couple of options when you decide to go there, and you've probably heard of full frame or crop sensor or micro four thirds camera. And usually you have to operate within your budget. Most people will recommend that if you can go for the full frame camera. I personally started off with a crop sensor camera, and I think that was a really good decision actually. So far I haven't felt the need to change it. I got the Sony a6500, and when I bought it, it was actually already several years old, and Sony was also releasing a new line of cameras on top of that. And what I found was that it pretty much filled all the needs that I had with landscape photography, and I don't see myself buying a new camera anytime soon because I just feel that with the technology that's already there, so it has 24 megapixels, that gives me plenty of room to actually print it and see a physical copy of it. So my advice would be to buy a several-year-old model camera. There are tons of guides out there for what different cameras you want to focus on. I suggest focusing on a mirrorless camera because that seems to be where a lot of the technology is headed. But also, one thing that I'll say is you want to buy a camera for which you can get lenses of all variety. So sticking with a reputable company would be ideal because a lot of third-party companies also make lenses for those. And we'll talk about lenses in a little bit, but you want to buy a camera where you'll have the option to choose different lenses, and so those are mostly Sony, Nikon, and Canon, etc. So let's move on to lenses, and this is where things can get a little bit more confusing because if you thought there were too many cameras to choose from when starting off with photography, add to that the number of lenses, and then add to that the different varieties of lenses and the third-party lenses involved as well. So usually when you're starting off in photography, you'll be perfectly fine with a kit lens, and I started off with a kit lens for my Sony camera, and it worked really well for the time being. So with a kit lens, you're kind of limited to a couple of different features. I found that if I wanted to take photos at night, it was pretty difficult to capture anything that it wasn't very noisy. And for my kit lens at least, if I wanted to zoom in much further away, it wouldn't be as sharp or not nearly as sharp as what ideally I would want it to be. I think starting off with a kit lens is perfectly fine, but I think you should go for a better lens as soon as you realize that you actually want to start doing more photography. With a kit lens, you can perfectly go out on hikes and explore your local areas and take photos of that, but I think once you start to develop a love of photography, you want to kind of upgrade a little bit. So there are a couple of different thoughts around this. Some people prefer prime lenses, other people prefer zoom lenses, and some people prefer wide angle, or other people prefer telescopic. So I have thoughts on all four. I don't think you should go for a prime, and I don't think you should go for a wide angle lens as your first lens after your kit lens, for example. So wide angle lenses are great for when you want to include a lot of things in your image, such as wide grand landscapes. But a lot of times they're also used for those hyper foreground images where the foreground seems a little bit distorted and it kind of leads you into the image itself. But I think those are extremely difficult to work with, especially when you're starting off, and they don't give you as much versatility as a zoom lens. Prime lenses in general, some people say that it's good to start off with that because then it limits you and you kind of have to move around a lot. But I think that's the wrong approach for beginners, because when you're beginning, you don't know what you like to photograph. You don't know how you want to try and compose things. You're kind of trying to explore as much as possible because you have no idea on what you actually like and what you can actually do. So starting off with a prime lens makes you, or gives you, the sharpest possible image likely, but I think when it comes to versatility, you want to stick with a zoom lens. And so the lens that I actually bought was a Tamron 28-200, actually recommended by one of my favorite YouTube photographers, Mads Peter Iversen. I think he's a Danish photographer, Danish landscape photographer, and it has worked extremely well. Now that is a pretty wide range, and one of the things that I focused on here was I wanted that level of range, but I also wanted to make it sharp. Usually when you get to that level of range in zoom, you kind of lose some sharpness. If it didn't have its flaws, I think it would cost a lot more. I see myself resolving to use this lens pretty much as my default, and I don't think I'll be getting rid of this lens anytime soon, especially since it's a full frame lens, meaning that I can actually buy a new camera body once I ever wanted to and actually use the same lens on top of that. It just has so much more versatility than any wide angle lens would give me. And sure, I use wide angle lens from time to time, but I think if I wanted one lens to keep with me starting from when I started to maybe even a couple of years down, it would be this 28-200 Tamron zoom lens. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the third and I guess most crucial piece of gear that I have for my landscape photography, which is my tripod. Now, originally I didn't really see a need for a tripod. I mean, a camera and a lens are usually what's most often talked about. And tripod I just saw as extra fluff on top of that. But the more and more I went out and shot landscape photography, the more and more I realized that if I wanted to be able to shoot at night, if I wanted to be able to shoot waterfalls or moving water and capture those long exposures, for example, I really needed a tripod to add stability. So usually you want to stick with either aluminum or carbon fiber tripods. Aluminum are more heavier, but carbon fiber is more expensive. Usually most of the professional landscape photographers will have a carbon fiber tripod, but if you're not willing to shell out up to from $500 to $1,000, I definitely recommend starting off with an aluminum tripod, even if it is a little bit more heavier to carry around. So that's actually what I did. I started off with the Manfrotto Befree tripod, and I would say it's nowhere near the top tier of tripods. So a couple of things that I wanted to focus on when buying a tripod was the stability and longevity. There were other things involved as well, such as like the maximum height it could go to or the weight, but I think for me, those were the two main factors, especially because I wanted to really stick within the budget and I didn't know whether or not a tripod would be necessary down the line. So you definitely want to make sure your tripod is stable and can hold the weight of your camera and the lens and potentially future lens you buy or future cameras you get, right? So now that we talked a little bit about the three main pieces of gear that I think are most crucial for my landscape photography, especially in the beginning, I want to kind of mention a couple of things that I think don't really make as much of a difference initially. Maybe down the line they have some value, but I think these things would include something like a camera backpack or an L bracket or a filter set. Those do cost a little bit more. L brackets usually not that much, but obviously the cost adds up the more and more accessories you buy. So I'll list down below the gear that I've used in the past and now currently use. Either way, I think one of the accessories that I think might be still important to have, which doesn't really cost that much at all, is a lens cleaning kit, because that becomes a little bit essential unless you're okay with having dust spots all over your image. Now finally, I want to talk about the mentality a beginner needs to have when they're purchasing landscape photography gear, especially when they're on a budget. If you're not on a budget, then this video probably isn't for you, because you could go and buy the best gear and you really wouldn't have to worry about anything else. When you buy the gear, I would highly suggest that you buy gear that is used. For photography in general, it seems like the used gear tends to hold up its value pretty well. So for example, if I buy a used lens, I could possibly sell it on the same used market for around the same cost, unlike buying a new lens, which then would depreciate a little bit just because I bought it and now it will be considered used. So all my gear is actually used gear. I bought it off of eBay, and I recommend you buy things off of trusted websites as well. One thing to note obviously is you need to buy it from a trusted source, because with used gear you're not really getting a warranty on the product itself, and you need to make sure that when you purchase something, you'll either be able to definitively tell whether or not it's working at that time, or you'll need a good money back guarantee, such as what eBay has for different items that don't match their listings or don't match the expectations of the listing. So I know there's also Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist, and I also know that these options aren't available for everyone. So I would suggest visiting a local camera store that would have used products but would have a good reputation and would honor the products that they sell. So when you've finally bought your gear, when do you know to buy the next piece of gear or the next piece of gear to improve that? And that's, I think, where you kind of need to determine what it is that you like about the photography that you're doing. Hopefully at that point you are able to answer the question of why landscape photography. That's something that I'll discuss in a later video, but you want to be able to answer that question, since that will kind of guide you in how you think about landscape photography and what you need to improve your landscape photography. So that's it. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you found something valuable, let me know in the comments below. If you've disagreed or have qualms with anything I said, also let me know in the comments below, and maybe we can discuss that as well. Alright, see you next time.